Guys. So welcome back to our video lessons. This is uh, the next or the first video lesson in the um, Unit 1, Part 2, part of the first unit here, which is focused entirely on research strategies and ways in which we conduct psychology. This is a really important unit or part of the unit. Moving forward, we're going to be talking a lot about the different types of research that is done, and having a firm foundation in the stuff that we're going to learn in the next few videos is going to really set you up for success or failure in this course if you don't have that understanding. So these are extremely important, and it's important that we pay attention to it. We've talked in class about the importance of having a scientific attitude, and the qualities that comprise that. Curiosity, skepticism, humility. So we're going to be talking about the scientific method quite a lot in this unit, and again, kind of throughout the course. So, but that's not what this video is about. That's kind of a bit of a teaser. This video is going to be exclusively on the descriptive methods that we, do research. And we'll talk more in detail about the other two, the correlational research and experimentation, in future videos. But in this video, we're just going to do the descriptive studies. We're also going to eventually be talking about statistics and the way that we can use statistics to help understand psychology and what our data is showing. If you're in stats now, that's great. You will have a little bit of an advantage. But for the rest of you, don't worry. It is minimal math that is required in this class. Although, yes, there is some math requirements. We're also going to talk about sampling. We're going to talk about sampling not in terms of sampling beats, but in terms of sampling people, or an animal population that we're studying or something like that. So we're going to be talking about how do we do that, and the different ways that that works and what that allows us to then infer from that sampling. And then we'll talk about claims of validity. We'll talk about, whether or not we can extrapolate something that we're learning in a lab to a larger population. So these are the main objectives of these next few videos. So let's just dive right into the descriptive studies. So based off of just the name, description, right? These next three types of studies are types of studies that describe behavior, whether it's our own or others. It's kind of the most fundamental type of research that psychologists can do. It is just as valid as experiments, but it just tells us different things. So a lot of times, guys, experimentation is the gold star, which is true because of what it can tell us. But that doesn't mean that there's not important descriptive studies that are happening on a regular basis in the field of psychology. So let's start with the most, I guess for lack of a better word, intimate one, which is a case study. A case study is an in-depth look at an individual or a small group in order to study their behavior. Psychology's roots are definitely firm in case studies. Freud, for example, our friend Sigmund here, really did all of his psychology through case studies, looking at individual people or again small groups of people, to try to understand why they're acting a certain way. Case studies are great in providing information, detailed information, but they are not able to be generalized to a larger population, right? So just because this one person does this one thing doesn't mean that everybody does that thing, right? You can think about different cultures. You can think about, I can't think of a good example off the top of my head. Let's say someone is a vegetarian or a vegan, right? That doesn't mean that everybody is a vegetarian or a vegan. It just means that this one person is. So there's a worry when we do case studies. Well, not a worry. It's just a limitation of that type of study, that it's something that is only going to be really able to be talked about in terms of just those individuals involved. But it is still really, really useful in the field of psychology. It helps highlight certain patterns um, that might be seen. It can help develop new hypotheses so that future study can be done on a certain population or a certain type of individual. Um, these are things that are really, really helpful in terms of psychology as a field, right? Even though it's not, uh, kind of generalizable, to use the psych terms, right? I can't take what I'm learning from this one person and expand it to the whole, human race or people in the United States or Pennsylvania or whatever. Um, but it does help generate new ideas that could spur future research. So case studies do have a place. They're really important. Like I said, a lot of early psychology was nothing but case studies. Um, and that really helps give us a better understanding of who we are and why we do the things we do. In terms of a clinical study, a clinical case study, this is where a therapist, usually in a therapist setting, probably similar to what is happening in the photo, um, tries to really understand an individual client and helps provide them with feedback and ways that they can either change their behavior or change their thinking to help them through problems. Um, so case studies have a role in the practical side of psychology, right, in the applied fields, if you will. And they have a role in the basic fields too, as generating the hypotheses for future studies. So those are case studies. I hope that makes sense. Let's move on to something that sometimes gets confused by case studies, and that's naturalistic observation. So naturalistic observation, with this image here, hopefully you guys at least recognize who that woman is. That's Jane Goodall. She spent her entire career and life living among chimpanzees and learning their behavior and cataloging it. She's a wonderful, wonderful primatologist. She's a great person to hear speak, um, and she did all of that through naturalistic observation. The big difference between naturalistic observation and case studies is that the people that you're studying, they're in their natural environment. People or organisms that you're recording their behavior in their natural environment. A case study, people know that they're being interviewed, right? They know that they're being part of a case study. But naturalistic observation aims to see behavior, thought processes, you name it, within the natural world, right? As people live their lives, it's really important that there's no manipulation of the environment. Okay, so um, an example I like to give is imagine if next time that we're in class, Mr. Chapman walks in and sits down at a desk and just starts watching. Um, we can expect some things to happen because of his presence, right? Maybe your behavior changes. Maybe you make sure that you're in dress code. Maybe my behavior changes, right? I'm being watched by Mr. Chapman. Maybe there's some hidden anxiety there about Mr. Chapman as the disciplinarian from when I was a student, right? Right. Our behaviors change because we know we're being watched. That is an issue for naturalistic observation, right? We know that someone else is watching. We're going to change our behaviors. So that means we're not getting a totally accurate depiction of what we're like in the world, right? That's not a good snapshot necessarily of what it's like to be in, our AP Psych class, on a regular basis. Um, but we can also understand that if Mr. Chapman showed up every day and was just part of the class, over time, he probably would start to see what it's like to be in a regular class, right? Our behavior is going to adapt to his presence. It's not going to be weird that the dean of students is sitting in on a classroom. It's just something that happens. Um, so the same thing happens in the natural world, both with humans and other animals, right? You've got the reason why Jane Goodall was so successful was because her presence eventually meant that she was accepted by the chimpanzee communities that she was studying, and they acted completely normal around her. They weren't acting any different just because she was there. But that meant she had to live among them for like 3 years without ever leaving, so that they got used to her presence. She would learn their mannerisms so that she could kind of project to them, that she was a friend and not someone to be afraid of. Right, naturalistic observation has its drawbacks in that. Right, it takes a long time. It takes a long time to do that. And similar to case studies, and actually all descriptive studies are kind of like this. it doesn't explain the behavior, right? If you're doing a case study and if you're, getting interviewed for a case study, you can try to talk through your behavior, why you do the things you're doing. Or if we look at the next descriptive study, which is a survey, right? You can maybe even indicate why you believe a certain thing or why you act the way you do in certain situations. For naturalistic observation, the person doing the observing needs to be, a neutral bystander. They're not going to interrupt and be like, "Hey, why did you just do that? Well, that's an interesting thing you just did." They're not going to do that because that's going to blow their cover, right? Um, so there's some limits there, more so than the other types of descriptive studies that limits naturalistic observation. But the important thing here again is it describes the behavior, right? Starting at a very baseline, just describing what you're seeing and the behavior that's happening is an important thing for the field of psychology, right? The same thing with case studies. It can generate future research. It can make people more interested in the field, right? Reading these things. So they definitely have their place. They're just a little bit limited in their scope. And same thing, you can't generalize to a larger environment most times because you're only looking at a certain group of individuals. Jane Goodall was able to kind of talk about chimpanzee behavior because she's been doing it for 50 years, and she knows the species inside and out. But that's only because it took her 50 years. All right, next up, let's talk about those surveys. Um, Surveys are an important tool that are used a lot. Whether that's, you're filling out your preference for when I should be posting schoolwork, to providing feedback on teachers, to or how hybrid ghost is going, or some other type of new change that's happening at our school. They ask you for some feedback. Um, to preferences on colleges, right? The college admissions process might provide you with surveys and you answer questions and it helps you find the right fit. A survey is basically, the boring psych definition, is a technique for obtaining self-reported attitudes, opinions, or behaviors. And the key word here is self-reported. Um, a survey asks an individual what they think or do, right? It's not seeing what they actually do. It's not naturalistic observation where you see them in their natural habitat. It is asking them point blank, "What are you doing? What are you thinking? What do you believe about this?" And then taking that information and compiling it. Obviously, surveys therefore can have flaws in that just because I say I believe something doesn't mean that that's necessarily what I'm going to do. We see that a lot in political polling, right? Um, that they some argue that this happened in 2016 as an explanation for why a lot of the polls didn't show Donald Trump winning the election, and it was because people didn't. The theory is that people, or the hypothesis, I should say, that people didn't want to say that they were voting for Donald Trump, so they didn't. They said they were voting for uh, Secretary Clinton, and then in the polling booth actually did vote for Donald Trump. Um, right, so that's an issue, right? If people are reporting something that isn't true or isn't what they really think, then that's going to skew the data. It's going to mess things up. Now, surveys, if we want to get an idea of what every single person thinks about something in, let's just say, the United States, um, yes, we could go out and survey every single individual and see what they think about a certain topic. But that's really expensive and really time consuming. Instead, there's a mathematical process, you don't need to know what it is, to determine whether or not something is a representative sample, right? So imagine, and I know some teachers that do this, imagine that you are given a giant jar of beads. Some are red, some are blue. And you're told to get what's the percentage? What's the percentage of red to blue? And yeah, does that mean you could go and count every single bead in that big jar? Yes. Will it take you a while? Yes. Will you get your a correct answer? Yes. But you can also get pretty close, if not almost exactly close, by taking a smaller section out of that larger jar and counting those. Again, depending on the survey, the sample size is going to range. Sometimes it's a smaller sample, sometimes it's a larger sample. The issue is it needs to be a representative sample. So a representative sample meaning that it is large enough to include all possible members of the population that you're studying. This is a good point for me to stop and say something about populations. Um, your book is going to define this, but it's important that you hear it here too, I think. A population is the entire group that you're studying, right? So a population could be Holy Ghost Prep students, it could be teenagers, it could be teenagers in the Philadelphia media market, it could be American teenagers, or it could be humans, right? Um, Depending on what population you're trying to study, right? So, which group are you actually trying to understand the behavior for, the self reported behavior or attitudes for, is going to dictate your population. And your survey size is going to depend on your population, right? So, depending on what your population is, you need to have a certain percentage fill out that survey. So, again, you don't need to necessarily poll the entire Holy Ghost Prep community to get their ideas on something you guys know I'm involved with, like core. If we get a representative sample, um, then we can extrapolate that data to all of Holy Ghost students. That doesn't mean that I can then take that sample, right? What people say in that survey, and say, oh, all students, all high school students, like or dislike, having, for lack of a better word, real conversations on certain topics, right? Um, that's not necessarily something that you can do because that's not who was studied in the population, right? So the population is going to limit it. And the other keyword here is it needs to be representative. When I send out those core surveys after we have a core session, um, that is not necessarily representative, right? People who either love core or hate core are probably going to be the ones to fill it out. The people who are indifferent, their voices are probably being left behind, which is why it's so important for everyone to fill out those surveys, because it helps capture, that more representative group, right, of our student body, and helps inform the decisions that are made as a school. Um, you can also do samples by really, there's two choices. There's random sampling and stratified sampling. I'm going to be clear with my words here. Random sampling does not necessarily mean random as you think it means. Random sampling simply means that every member of the population that's being studied has an equal chance of being part of the sample population. Okay, I'll say that again. A random sample means that every member of the population you are studying has an equal chance of being part of the sample. Okay, um, that's what random sampling does. The benefits of random sampling is that it allows you to generalize to the larger population. Okay, if you do a random sample well, then you can say, okay, this is a representative sample, smaller section of that larger population. But since I did my job at making it random and it hit the threshold that we needed, I can now, uh, expand and say all Holy Ghost students believe this way, or something like that. This gets knocked a bunch. Again, where there's election seasons, you'll hear people talk about polls, who's winning this state versus that state, who's winning this race. And sometimes they'll say, Joe Biden is in the lead over President Trump by 7%. We polled people in Pennsylvania, and this was the finding. And then you hear the details, and it's, they polled 1,000, 1,200 people. It's like, wow, okay, that's nowhere near the size of Pennsylvania. But based off of the math, 1,200 randomly selected people from Pennsylvania can give a representative sample. So therefore, they're allowed to make that claim in good faith and saying this is what Pennsylvania is looking like. Those numbers were made up, by the way. I have no idea what that is. And so don't either. Yeah, so just take that as with a grain of salt. I don't know what the numbers are. A stratified sample does something a little bit differently. A stratified sample looks at the population at large that you're studying and tries to find out how many, make sure that there are certain percentages represented in the sample that match the same percentage as a whole. So, for example, the senior class, let's just say, is a little bit larger than the other classes, the junior, sophomore, freshman classes. So that means that if I'm doing a stratified sample, that I need to make sure that slightly, a handful more seniors fill out a survey than junior class, than sophomore class, than freshman class, because there's slightly more seniors, and we need to make sure that we get their ideas together. Same thing happens again in politics and political polling. The population of the United States is important to keep track of, whether or not polls and surveys are going to be accurate. So, African Americans make up 13% of the US population. So, theoretically, in any survey that's meant to go through the entire United States, should have 13% of the respondents in this sample be African American. That is a stratified sample. Um, that's how that works. So random is everyone who is in the population has an equal shot of being picked. Stratified sample looks more at social breakdowns within the population at large and wants to replicate those breakdowns on a smaller level within the sample. Both can give you representative samples. Both can kind of be random. I'm the type of guy, at least not so much anymore, but usually, I'm on some do not call lists, but people would call my cell phone or whatever, or at the time, at one point, I had a home phone as an adult, which is weird. But I would get a phone call, I'd pick up, and they'd say, "Hey, do you have a few minutes for a survey?" And I'd say, "Yeah, of course," because helping people out, helping collect data, and they would say, "What's your age range?" And they would provide an age range. And sometimes, when I would tell them, they would say, "Okay, thank you," and hang up, because they already had enough people in that age range to answer this poll. They don't need me anymore. And there's, polling software and stuff on computers that people are just reading from the screen, and that's helping them understand, um, oh, we already have enough. I don't need to ask you. Thank you for your time. And sometimes, oh, okay, let's keep going. So they're using kind of a combination of a random and a stratified sample there in those situations. Okay. There is something called wording effects. The way that a survey is worded affects the results of the survey. This makes a whole bunch of sense if you think about it. People are going to choose something that fits closest to their ideas. And if there's an issue or something isn't clear, then that's going to be a difficult, they're not going to get necessarily perfect responses. So there's a lot of time, there needs to be a lot of time devoted to developing effective surveys that are free of wording effects, so that people can actually have their actual attitudes or opinions reported correctly. Um, I'll give you an example. This was back in 2016. I picked up the phone and it was a poller, and they asked me a question. It started out kind of normal, and then they asked me a question about, are you going to let uh, what's your opinion on the disastrous policies of Donald Trump? And I just said, whoa, okay, you just totally invalidated the objectivity of this survey. Um, that you're leading my response by your question. That is a bad question. And I told them that, and I basically stopped the survey. I actually got in a little bit of an argument with the person giving the survey, because it's not their fault. They're just reading what it says. But that's a problem, right? That the way that the survey is worded really affects how people respond to it. So a lot of psychometrics, to use a term from the previous unit, go into determining what is an effective wording of a survey or a question. And then this is just something that I think is interesting about surveys. If you ask people, what's your opinion on X? They'll say whatever it is, and then if you ask what's your percentage of people who agree with you, and people think that everybody agrees with them on everything. which is interesting because we know that that's not true. If you ask, uh, again, I hate to keep bringing it back to politics, but if you ask a Democrat how many Democrats there are, they're more likely to say that more people agree with Democratic policies than actually do. Same thing with Republicans. More Republicans will say that more Americans agree with Republican policies than they actually do. We like to think of ourselves as always in the largest group, right? We don't like to think that the thing that I think about is weird or is marginalized or is a fringe idea. And that's actually really dangerous, right? Because then you can have like some fringe ideas becoming more and more popular. That's how conspiracy theories work. That's how a bunch of people can be misguided. Um, but it's interesting because when you actually do the surveys and you do the studies, that does give you a better sense of where things break down. So ending this video with surveys is an important thing for us to just kind of remember that um, surveys have their flaws, right? In that they are self-reported, so that you can potentially skew the results by not being honest, or maybe not even being aware that you're not honest. Um, the sample needs to be a random stratified sample that follows the population that is being studied. If it is done correctly, then that sample can be representative of the larger population. So you don't need to survey all 430 whatever Holy Ghost students. You can survey maybe 60 of them. And if you do it well, then that should be valid. We know that the wording of a survey affects the way that the survey is filled out. Um, and we also know that surveys highlight the fact that we think that we are always in the majority, right? The most popular group. So that's it for descriptive studies of case studies, uh, naturalistic observation, and surveys. If you have questions about this, make sure that you let me know. Next video, we will be spending some time talking about correlations and how they help us predict certain behaviors. All right, guys, until next time.